How do we continue to go through life and design a diet that we know will be more dependent on dietary protein and movement as we age? Because the balance between the two changes. When you're young, you could eat the Twinkie diet, probably look at a weight and grow. Age is the great equalizer. I trained in geriatrics, and I am telling you, age is the great equalizer, and creating protocols and habits put into place to allow you to age well is everything.
You have a different stance on this incredible organ that we call muscle. So if you would just tell us how you look at this thing that we call muscle. In men, in women, in kids, in old people, young people, how should we think about muscle?
Well, first of all, muscle is the organ of longevity. And we've always thought about muscle, just as you said, when it comes to exercise, performance, mobility, and strength, which, by the way, all of those things are important and critical for life. But there's something very unique and special to skeletal muscle. First of all, it's an organ system. It's an endocrine organ. It is responsible for a large component of glucose disposal, roughly 80% of glucose disposal. And we all hear about these things like cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes, obesity. Largely, many of these metabolic diseases begin in skeletal muscle decades before.
Interesting.
Skeletal muscle is also an amino acid reservoir. It is the place that your body pulls from amino acids. And that is something that changes as we age, this idea of protein turnover, and we require healthy skeletal muscle. Of course, it's the body armor that we all know, and it is really responsible for how we age.
How does one go from being under-muscled to properly muscled?
I think that it's a really good point, this idea of being appropriately muscled. So the truth is, I can't tell you how much skeletal muscle mass you should have for optimal health. I don't know how much skeletal muscle mass I should have for optimal health. We haven't done a good job in the literature and just as a population being able to track skeletal muscle and know what is optimal. We are really good at looking at body fat, and we're really good at looking at bone. But when it comes to skeletal muscle, DEXA is an extrapolation. We traditionally use DEXA. DEXA looks at bone and it looks at lean tissue collectively. Part of lean tissue is skeletal muscle mass. It doesn't determine the health of skeletal muscle mass. It doesn't determine anything about the quality of that tissue. It purely looks at lean tissue, which then we determine part of that lean tissue, maybe it's 40% is skeletal muscle. And that's important to understand as we begin to frame up the conversation as how much skeletal muscle should I have? I have no idea. But what I can tell you is that if I were to look at your blood work and I saw something like elevated triglycerides or elevated insulin or elevated glucose, I would begin to understand that the health of your skeletal muscle isn't where it should be. And by the way, the health of skeletal muscle mass begins when we're young. This idea of sarcopenia, which it is a decrease in muscle mass and function. But interestingly, we don't necessarily know what one should have. So when we think about how we maintain the health of skeletal muscle, one of the things that I didn't mention is that skeletal muscle is a nutrient-sensing organ. It is uniquely sensitive to the quality of our diet. The quality of our diet defined as the quality of the amino acids that we're gaining. And that would be, for the listener, dietary protein. Skeletal muscle is sensitive to one of the amino acids, leucine. And depending on the quality of the diet, meaning how much leucine that you're getting in any given meal, will then stimulate muscle health.
Not just muscle size, but muscle health.
Muscle health. And the way that we think about muscle health is by proxy, is this concept called muscle protein synthesis, which we can measure. And when we get a dietary protein amount, which is between 30 and 50 grams of high-quality protein, it stimulates skeletal muscle.
Is it possible for somebody to have a lot of muscle, but their muscle health is poor?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Conversely, can somebody have a moderate to low amount of muscle, but their muscle quality is high, or is that less common?
Well, the first thing that you said is absolutely something that we see, is that in an individual that carries a lot of muscle and say they're inactive, there's a big discussion about how heavy individuals will have more muscle mass. But what we have to recognize is the health of that skeletal muscle is fat deposition can be visceral fat deposition, fat around the organs, and it can be also fat infiltrate into the tissue, like, not to gross anyone out, a marbled steak. And that's exactly what can happen to unhealthy skeletal muscle, which then affects its ability to contract, which also affects, there's a ton of mitochondria in skeletal muscle. It affects the efficiency of skeletal muscle. So yes, someone can have potentially more muscle, but more unhealthy muscle. But if we can correct our nutrition and we gear it towards skeletal muscle health, then we can change the trajectory of aging. And we can stop focusing on obesity and really focus on skeletal muscle health. But the only way that we're going to do that is if we get this nutrition right. Because skeletal muscle requires dietary protein. There's only two main ways that we can stimulate skeletal muscle. And that is through exercise, primarily resistance training, and dietary protein. And so when we think about how we design a diet, if you look back at the history, we have to recognize a handful of things. Number one, that these essential amino acids, primarily leucine, is necessary to trigger muscle protein synthesis, number one. Number two, that aging impairs the efficiency of muscle protein synthesis. You know, we talk about health span, we talk about lifespan. There's also muscle span. And muscle span is this concept that is really about the skeletal muscle health as we age. And there's three primary components to that. That's understanding that skeletal muscle health begins very early on. And then as we think about this muscle span, there is early on, early age, where you're laying down the foundation, where you're hopefully training, doing exercise, just doing movement.
I'm starting to get a picture where in order to have healthy muscle, we need to think about the feeding of that muscle, the providing of nutrients to that muscle, that is, as well as the use of that muscle. Maybe let's start with the feeding or the providing of nutrients to that muscle.
Dietary protein, we speak about it as if it's one thing, but actually it's 20 different amino acids, 9 of which are essential. The rest we can generate in our body. And when we think about skeletal muscle, we think about the essential amino acids. And the essential amino acids primarily for skeletal muscle health are the branch chain amino acids, leucine being one of those. So leucine is uniquely stimulating to skeletal muscle. And when you have enough leucine, it triggers muscle protein synthesis.
And when you say stimulating and muscle protein synthesis, I think a lot of people get a picture in their mind of a muscle growing. But
no,
you're not necessarily talking about that. You're talking about the organ that is muscle, that its health, its metabolism being cultivated so that it can do all the hormone endocrine related things and the glucose disposal related things that we'll get into in a bit more detail later. Is that right?
Yeah. And so when you have a breakfast of 30 to 50 grams, you appropriately stimulate muscle protein synthesis. And one has to recognize that if you eat below that threshold, you do not stimulate the health of that skeletal muscle. You do not stimulate muscle in a way that would be necessary for outcomes that matter. And outcomes that matter are sarcopenia. Outcomes that matter are body composition, prevention of obesity. You must get this nutrition right. It's the thing that 100% of people do, is eat.
Do you recommend that people eat a true breakfast, like within a certain number of hours of waking up, for sake of muscle health?
When we're thinking about designing a plan for skeletal muscle health, that first meal is most important. That first meal of the day, having dietary protein, will set you up metabolically for the rest of the day. When we think about that first meal, I frankly don't care when you have it. One also has to understand that you're coming out of an overnight fast. If you are young and healthy, then the timing of that first meal likely doesn't matter because you are robust. Your body is very efficient and capable to withstand protein degradation.
Mm-hmm.
It's able to withstand protein degradation and protein turnover, which is ultimately why we're eating. So that's one reason why we're eating. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. That first meal of the day, if you are young and healthy, the timing doesn't really matter. And I would say when it begins to matter is when you're older. When you are in your 60s, continuing to fast may be a negative for muscle health. That first meal of the day is important because we know that when you get between 40 and 50 grams of protein, that first meal of the day, you stimulate muscle protein synthesis. Muscle protein synthesis is by proxy what we use to measure as a marker for overall muscle health. Now, there's a lot of history here when we think about designing a meal plan. That first meal has we'll say, give it between 30 to 50 grams of dietary protein. That will do a number of things. Number one, it will stimulate skeletal muscle, what we would consider the health of skeletal muscle. It also will affect the brain. It'll improve satiation. You and I were talking previously. It releases a handful of gut peptides.
Like glucagon, like peptide 1, which
GLP,
later we'll talk about.
GLP,
Ozempic, Mounjaro.
CCK, PYY, things that will affect appetite for that second meal. And there's some very interesting research out of Heather Leidy's lab. And basically, when she put individuals, younger adolescents, on a meal of 30 to 40 grams of protein, they were much less likely to choose, say, donuts or something outside of what we would consider a healthy nutrition plan.
Later in the day or in the same meal?
Later in the day.
What are some excellent sources of quality protein for that first meal?
Typically, animal-based proteins have higher quality. These are hard, fast biological numbers. The dietary protein in, say, a steak is very similar to the protein amino acid in skeletal muscle. So the quality of the proteins like eggs, like whey protein, like beef, like poultry, those compositions are similar to the human body composition. So they contain the amino acids in the appropriate ratios for skeletal muscle health. Now, plant-based proteins have a different composition, and they have a composition obviously similar to plants. And one can get enough of the essential amino acids if the total caloric load of that protein is high enough.
What other supplements, and maybe we should put whey protein in here as well?
Yes, whey protein, it's interesting. Whey protein and whey protein concentrate has alpha-lactalbumin and lactoferrin and these immunoglobulins that can be very beneficial. Whey protein concentrate or whey protein isolate, those are both processed. However, it is a great way to get your essential amino acids, which are amino acids that you must get from the diet. Your body cannot make them. There's been a lot of research with whey protein, has very little downside, and it's easily tolerated. Those that have challenges with lactose can use the whey protein isolate versus the concentrate.
What about other supplements, including fish oil, omega-3 fatty acids?
There's a lot of research around that, and I think that it's a positive. It's not only a positive for brain function, but it seems to have a unique anabolic effect. Maybe it is in, potentially on the ribosomes. We're not sure, at least I'm not sure at this time, but there seems to be even more emerging evidence that it may even impact women differently. Again, I can't say that in all certainty, but nearly all of my patients are on some form of fish oil.
Is salmon, quality protein?
Salmon is a quality protein. It is higher in fat. Again, calorie balance does matter. Fish is interesting. Fish has 5 grams of protein per 1 ounce versus meat has, on average, 7 grams, 7 or 8. Red meat has 7 or 8 grams of protein per 1 ounce. Heart is also a good source of protein. It's also high in CoQ10, which is good for muscle health. But many people, again, we don't seem to eat that. However, other places eat the full animal. But they are all good sources of protein, aside from collagen, which would be that protein score of 0. How do we continue to go through life and design a diet that we know will be more dependent on dietary protein and movement as we age? Because the balance between the two changes. When you're young, you could eat the Twinkie diet, probably look at a weight and grow. Age is the great equalizer. I trained in geriatrics, and I am telling you, age is the great equalizer, and creating protocols and habits put into place to allow you to age well is everything. When you think about the metabolic implications of skeletal muscle as glucose disposal unit, these diseases of aging really begin in skeletal muscle before you see any outward signs of obesity, before you see any outward signs of anything that would indicate you are unhealthy. It's kind of like osteoporosis as the silent disease. Skeletal muscle health is also that way. And what happens to skeletal muscle as we age? Skeletal muscle, if it is not contracted and utilized, gets this fat infiltration. mitochondria changes, protein turnover changes. It becomes less efficient at sensing amino acids. There's a decrease in capillary perfusion, which is one reason why exercise is so important. Being sedentary is a disease state in and of itself. Period. End of story. Being sedentary is not the opposite of activity. Being sedentary is in and of itself a diseasome of inactivity. Then midlife, we have to maintain the tissue. We get a peak muscle mass in our 30s. We get a peak bone mass around the same time. And then that later half of life, we have to do everything that we can to maintain that tissue because of this decrease in efficiency of skeletal muscle.
What are some things that people might be doing or taking that inadvertently disrupt muscle health and perhaps even hypertrophy?
One thing that people often use is ibuprofen. And ibuprofen, while not inherently bad, there's some evidence to suggest that higher doses of ibuprofen can impact muscle health, whether it's hypertrophy or strength. I often think about those together, but ibuprofen use, it's also not good for the gastric lining. Again, you have to be able to absorb your nutrients to be able to become strong and healthy. The other thing is obviously statin use. Some people do need statins. I'm not saying that we shouldn't, but that can certainly affect muscle health. The side effect can be muscle pain, myalgia, muscle soreness. It can deplete CoQ10.
Is occasional use of these things okay?
Yeah, of course.
Okay.
And, obviously check with your doctor. But things that suppress inflammation, like aspirin potentially or other NSAIDs, aspirin is in a category of its own, but NSAIDs in particular seem to suppress skeletal muscle at certain doses, hypertrophy potentially and strength.